so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're so welcome. I am so happy to be here, Natasha.
This is a good topic for so many people that listen to this podcast, and for myself as well, because picky eating is just a huge component of a lot of what goes on with the kids that I work with, with sensory issues, anxiety issues. Picky eating seems to come with it as well. So I thought it'd be really good to sit back and talk to you about what is the difference between typical picky eating and when is it actually kind of a problem that parents should really be concerned about, or at least kind of roll up their sleeves and work on.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we use this umbrella term for picky eating, and I think using that umbrella term kind of comes with a lot of consequences for people that are really dealing with the bigger problem, which we can talk about that in a minute. But to answer your question, for me, there's a distinction between what I would call the typical picky eater, that most children go through that phase, usually between the ages of like 1 to 2 years old and 5 years old. We see that they don't prefer vegetables. We see that they kind of like those childhood favorites, but those childhood favorite foods that they're eating, like chicken nuggets, pizza, and hot dogs, they are able to eat those anywhere and in any way. So if they're at a friend's house, they can have the pizza that their mom made, or the pizza from a different pizza shop, or they will eat chicken nuggets, all different sorts of ways. They usually are willing to try some new things, and they usually have more than 20 foods in their diet. So on the flip side of that, when we see picky eating becoming more of a problem that needs addressed, children are usually eating less than 20 foods, and sometimes as few as 2 or 3 foods in their diet. So it can be that low. And we also see children have a very extreme reaction to new and different foods. So they are throwing tantrums when new or different foods are presented in front of them, instead of just I don't like that, or I don't want to eat that, which is kind of the response a typical or average picky eater would have. A child that's facing more extreme picky eating is going to gag, they're going to maybe even throw up, push that food away, resist coming to the table, have a lot of stress and anxiety around the food itself. And also these kiddos will starve themselves before eating a new food. So that advice that kind of seems to float around to just let your kid get hungry enough and they'll eventually eat that lasagna or the broccoli that you really want to eat will not happen for these kids. They will literally make themselves sicker, sometimes causing themselves to throw up stomach bile or get migraines or have horrible stomach pains before they would even consider eating that new food.
And you're bringing up some really good points, because I think a lot of us hear stuff like that, like kids won't starve to death, and maybe you just need to be a little bit tougher on them. And I know, even from my own perspective as a mom and not a therapist, my oldest daughter had sensory processing. Well, she has sensory processing disorder, and it really manifested mostly with oral defensiveness and just her inability to eat at all. And I remember at like 2, she couldn't eat anything. Like, she was falling off the growth chart. She was failure to thrive. And the pediatrician, who was very old school, I loved him, but he was very old school, didn't really understand what was going on. And he just said, no child's going to starve to death. Just put a little Chinese food on her high chair. It's to be delicious. She'll eat it.
Right.
She did not. And she continued to starve until I had to kind of figure out myself how to help her, because I wasn't getting any advice, through her pediatrician.
Yeah. And I think that's what is so dangerous. So I had mentioned before that this umbrella term of picky eating is dangerous for those that are really facing what most feeding therapists, there's lots of different words for it. I use the term extreme picky eating. Others use problem feeders. Some people use resistant eaters, but all of those terms sort of categorize these kids that are more extreme. But, in our language, we're all just using the same term, picky eaters. So we think when we're helping a friend or the doctor's just giving out that advice, that it applies to everyone, but it really does not apply to kids that have moved into this extreme sort of place, because there's just so many deep emotional reactions to it. Often, as you said, sensory is a huge component for it for a lot of kids. So there's neurological stuff going on for reasons why they're choosing to eat certain foods and not eat others.
Yeah, and I think sometimes even with partners, we have some disagreements. I think that can be something that also becomes an issue, because it's how do you handle that when you have a partner who's saying it's just because you're not pushing him hard enough, or you're just not being tough enough. We all eat this, and this is what you make. We shouldn't, make other foods for them. And so sometimes it causes even some distress in your relationships because you're not aligned.
Yeah, absolutely. I hear this constantly from my audience, from my students, that this is a challenge that they're facing. And I think, again, some of that comes from, we look back to the way that we were raised. And I think a lot of these issues weren't as prevalent. You can make the same argument for sensory processing disorder and autism and those types of things. Like a few generations ago, were not at the forefront the way they are now. And we don't need to go down that rabbit hole now about why that is. However, we look back to the way that we were raised, and we think that, well, we turned out okay. So I think that the key to getting on the same page is really starting to educate together, because what I find is when the partner or spouse learns what's really happening with our picky eaters, that there's a reason that they're acting this way, that there usually are deep underlying issues, and that it can be improved, and that also the solution is finding a balance, not necessarily giving your child everything that they want to eat all the time. There's a middle ground there, and it's, the solution also isn't never giving them what they want to eat at any meal. And I think when you can find a middle ground as parents, you can agree to get on the same page. Or what some of my students do is they kind of come and make an agreement together to give a plan or a particular strategy a solid try for a trial amount of time, and they can agree, and let's see what the results are after 2 months or 3 months or even a month's time. Like, let's see if we can just both be all in on this and see what the results are. And I think that can have huge benefits, because like you said, it can just cause so much stress. And there's already enough stress at meal times with what a child is not eating.
Oh, completely. And I like that. I think sometimes it's good if you're not aligned, if you and your partner are not aligned, sometimes it's either, if you're not going to see eye to eye, sometimes it's good to just say, you do your thing, research, come up with a plan, and I'll back off for like 2 months, and this will be your show. And then we'll see how that goes. It's nice if you guys can just work on the plan together, but I have had parents where I've worked with where they're not aligned with sleep, or they're not aligned with eating, and there is some big issue going on, and they disagree on how to approach it. And sometimes it is just good to like hand the baton to the other parent, just say, okay, I'll stay out of this for a little while, and this will be your show, and we'll see how it goes. So that's another option.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just to speak a little bit too, I think sometimes we can get caught in the trap of thinking, well, what our parents did worked. And I think that there's some truth in that. But at the same time, I think we also have to acknowledge that what the vast majority of our parents were doing, for for generations was a very kind of black and white approach. And we do have some consequences to those sort of traditional approaches as a society with food. You know, most of us were raised with some sort of reward system around food, or clean plate club, or take a bite of this and you can have more of that. And we're really ingraining in our kids to look to food as a reward, and to also bypass the healthier foods, the foods that we really want them to be eating. We're subtly teaching them that those are the lesser foods, while we're putting up the desserts or the foods that they prefer, which most parents would argue are falling into that junk food type category, as the foods to really be desired. And that stuff continues with us throughout our adult lives. So that's also an important piece, I think. And it's kind of a paradigm shift for a lot of us to start wrapping our head around. But it's really important. And when we start to step back and look at it, it's pretty easy to see those parallels with us as adults now.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, that it's just part of kind of culturally or the family dynamic of how many of us do things. So, and I never really thought about that, just kind of the message that it's sending to our kids. So I wonder if we can go into kind of like some of the origins of what causes like intense picky eating.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, there's so many factors that attribute to picky eating, and there are often many layers to picky eating. So it's common for a child to have been eating well and then suddenly not. It's also, I would say, probably equally as common, maybe 50-50 is what I see with my students. And I think in my practice and in what I see in my students is that it's a good half and half split of kids that had a really difficult time getting started with eating from day one, and kids that seem to be eating well, and then suddenly everything just started to change. And in both cases, there's a lot of layers to that. So in the case of kids that were eating well and then not, the first layer to that picky eating often starts with that typical picky eating phase. And it can really get much bigger because as our kids become more selective, they're exposed to less. They kind of like shut themselves down and they protect themselves. And in comes a sensory component now because they are becoming more defensive because they're just not being exposed to as much. At the same time, we see other kids that have started as babies. I mean, even when they're just starting to eat table foods, sometimes even just pureed baby food for the first time, really struggling with foods because of underlying sensory issues. So I know you talk about sensory in your show, but sensory as it relates to food is really about how our mind is perceiving the way foods feel, the way foods smell, the way they taste. It's this combination of lots of different sensory experiences that we all sort of take for granted. However, if we stop and think about it, sensory plays a huge role for all of us. We all have certain flavors that we crave and that we love, some that we don't like as much, and some that we can't even stand, even if we ourselves are not picky eaters. We all kind of have those preferences based on how our brain is wired. So sensory is one of the hugest components that I see affecting our kids with eating. And sometimes we don't see sensory being affected in many other areas. I think you even said with your daughter, it was primarily showing up with her orally. Of course, that's not always the case. Sometimes as my students learn that sensory is a bigger component, they start to see all of the different ways sensory has subtly been affecting their child in other areas of their life that was kind of flying under the radar because so many parents don't know about sensory processing. So sensory is definitely a huge one. Some others are medical reasons. There are definitely just tons of minor issues that can be going wrong with our children's digestion, with the mechanics of swallowing. Sometimes these things are incredibly rare. Sometimes they're super common things like reflux. I mean, the number or percentage of children that now experience reflux, it just keeps increasing. And when our children have felt that discomfort and pain for so long, they don't even know how to identify it. They don't know how to put a word to it because it's just how they've always felt. But intuitively, they are really reactive to new and different foods because they know it's going to cause them more discomfort, or they're already in discomfort and don't want to put more into their body. And at the same time, they can recover from those issues, but the lasting impression of the pain remains. So for a lot of our kids that have undergone any kind of medical issues that we may or may not be aware of, I mean, sometimes we're very aware, well, my child had to be hospitalized for a surgery and they had a feeding tube for 2 weeks purely for medical reasons. But the trauma of that has left such an impression on them that they are extremely cautious of new or different foods hitting their mouth because it's so uncomfortable.
And that's an interesting component. The medical component is something that I guess I don't really think about. And so I wonder, if you know your child didn't have a medical trauma, are there things that you should be ruling out with your pediatrician that are anatomical, or would that be more of a like a speech therapist or an OT?
It could be both. The pediatrician is always the first stop because there can be some things like a lip tie or a tongue tie. So like the lip is attached too closely and it doesn't allow them to chew well, or the tongue is attached too closely and they cannot get a lot of tongue movement. We need our lips and our tongues a lot to actually chew and eat our food well. So some of those issues can be diagnosed by a doctor, and it's definitely the first thing that I would ask a pediatrician. However, you might really have to fight for it because, as you said, when you went to your pediatrician, especially kind of old school thinking pediatricians may kind of brush that off a little bit. And I do think that if you've asked and they've looked, to get further testing done can be invasive. Like you might be needing to see a pediatric GI specialist and even be having an endoscopy done, which does require sedation. And that's a pretty serious step that you need, that you may or may not need to take. So to prelude that, I usually do like to rule out, other sorts of issues before we're kind of taking those more invasive ones. However, just having some more awareness of what your child is doing can really start to clue in. Sometimes we're really missing some of those subtle signs because we're just not looking for them. So when we step back and watch, are they complaining about stomach pains ever? Are they seem like they wince or have a difficult time swallowing? Do you ever notice like coughing or choking, like when they're trying to swallow? Or even if they're not saying that they're in pain, do you see them looking like they're in pain? So if you're dealing with a child that doesn't have the language yet, like maybe they are 2 and there's just no way that they're going to be able to articulate that. Do you notice that they go lay down after they eat or at certain times during the day? Again, sometimes we can have clues. And I do think parents, when we start to pay attention to that, there are some really strong intuitive guides there that can really start to point us to, wait, there might be something medical going on. But I will say that for me, that's the smallest segment of kids that I see, is that there's a medical component. So I'm always looking to sensory first, and also possibly like some oral motor components, just difficulty coordinating and chewing, all that sorts of stuff. Chewing is a skill, just like walking, so our kids have to be able to figure that out. And sometimes that can play a role too. Not to mention that any or all of those things can be in the mix and be parts of different layers that are going on with the extreme picky eating situation.
Yeah. Picky eating can be so many things that it seems like, I think it depends on who you're talking to as far as what they'll see, because you've got the sensory component, and, so if you're talking to someone in that world, they're going to see it as possibly sensory, or you have just the anatomy of the mouth and the functioning of the mouth, that if that's your specialty. And then you have the mental health world where they have actually just created, I don't know if you've heard the diagnosis ARFID.
Oh, I've heard it. Yes.
Okay. I'm sure you have to deal with
Yeah.
But I don't know how you feel about ARFID, but I feel like it's such a catch-all diagnosis of, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, whatever it stands for.
Right.
A lot of times parents in my world will just say, oh, my child has ARFID. Like, that's kind of like, that's the answer. And to me, just as a mom with 3 kids who have had eating issues for 3 really big different reasons, one had total sensory processing disorder and has reflux, and so you could just tell the way she's eating. It was from birth, and she did not know how to eat. Her motor skills were just completely messed up,
Yeah.
And even now she probably wouldn't like me saying this, but she's almost 16. I see her eating predominantly in the front, and food. She has a hard time keeping food in her mouth, like you could just still see some of those things that she's adapted to. But you could see where it's a physical struggle for her. And then my second child, we'll just go through my kids, he has OCD. And so there is a pandas and pans component to, I think, kids who have eating issues where it could be under the umbrella of ARFID, but just randomly spitting food out because he thinks he's going to choke, but having no trauma, no physiological issue with his mouth, and just having an intrusive thought that says, what if I choke? And then it can get really weird, like, is the food contaminated? Is the food watching me? Then we're dealing with pure like OCD stuff, but it presents as a food issue, where the go-to foods are going away as quickly as they were there. And you have 2 go-to foods and your child's ready to be G-tubed, And then the little third one, she just has like an acute sense of smell, and she has stomach aches. And so I thought she was just a picky eater, and I thought she was just anxious. And I brought her to the doctor, and she had celiac disease. And so there was a medical component to hers where now she's afraid to eat because she's worried it will hurt her stomach. And so whenever she gets sick or has pain, she eliminates those foods. And so she's quickly reducing her foods to, things that are not good and can't sustain her because she doesn't get sick on those. So I think it's just a rundown of, and all of them could be considered, having a diagnosis of ARFID, so.
Absolutely. And I have to admit, I take a little bit of a deep breath because I hear the diagnosis a lot, and my reaction is the same as yours. I feel like in a lot of cases, it's become an answer for a lot of people. And my message is that there is help no matter what. Like, that's not the end of the road. Just recently I shared something on my Facebook page. It was a little image with a statistic that says 10 to 11% of kids will not eventually eat when they get hungry. Kind of what we were talking about earlier in our discussion here. And it broke my heart to see the amount of comments that came in underneath of people saying, yes, my child is like, I'm so glad to see this, but we've just accepted that this is our way of life. And I think that there's obviously some good in that if you're not in that stressful state, because obviously with these eating issues, with the extreme picky eating, there's often so much stress on everybody involved. So that's definitely progress if you're able to move past a place and say, okay, we have that diagnosis, we're just going to accept this, and you're not in that stressful state. However, no matter what your child is dealing with, like past trauma, medical issues, sensory, there is so much hope and so much that can be done. I've worked with children that were on feeding tubes and only eating 1 to 2 foods and watched them move to a healthy diet where they were eating a variety of foods. That's to say that that's not going to be solved with one quick tip or trick. And it's certainly a journey and a process that you go on. But it does concern me that that diagnosis is saying that that's the explanation and that there's nothing else that can be done, because there's so much that can be done, even for our most extreme and complicated picky eaters.
And I think a lot of people just don't know what to do, because from what I've seen, they just go from, okay, just acceptance of, okay, I'm just going to feed you potato chips every day because that's all you're going to eat. Like literally,
Right.
goldfish. It's a big one in my house.
Right.
To, how do I just like force them how to eat all this stuff? And so it's really understanding and, having a plan and having someone teach you, going step by step so that you feel guided, because it's not intuitive. It's not something that is common sense. I think you really need the guidance of someone who knows how to navigate you through that. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's where, again, that we run into trouble with that general picky eating term, because a lot of those kind of intuitive strategies that we would use, like using dessert as a reward or not feeding them until they're hungry, those are the picky strategies that we're hearing, and they are not effective for this group. So parents hear that, they know in their gut most of the time that's not going to work for their kid, but they feel they have nothing left to try. So they try it. It doesn't work, and it just feels all the more hopeless, because like you said, you just don't know what to do. And there isn't just one quick trick. It really is a plan. Whereas for an average or typical picky eater, you can kind of pull out some tips and tricks and be like, oh, wow, that really made a difference, that recipe, or doing that one thing. Oh yeah, they tried a couple of new foods with that. That's not going to be the case for an extreme picky eater.
And that's probably where parents get hopeless, because I see this from a parental perspective, even more so than as a therapist, just because it's like an add-on to the stuff I deal with in my practice, but it's not my core thing I deal with. But parentally is something I deal with every single day. And I could see where it would get frustrating, because even when you see people who say they're going to help you with picky eating, that they're just going to tell you to hide the vegetables in something or just mix it with a sauce. And you're like, you don't get it. I can't eat my child isn't going to eat your sauce. That's not on her go-to list. So I think sometimes it's those common picky eating strategies that you feel like defeated because you feel like people just don't get it. And so I think it's having a plan. And also I think with ARFID, just to circle back with that, just to close that up, I think ARFID's a good start. It's not the end. And so if there's some validation to say my child has a disorder, because that's how I'm feeling about it. I'm feeling pretty overwhelmed. This is not normal. This is not developmentally appropriate. Thank you for giving me a disorder so I can feel validated that, yes, this is clinically an issue. But then you don't stop with that. I feel like you still want to figure out, is it sensory-based? Is it medical? Or in my world, is it anxiety, fear-based, fear of choking, fear of throw up? Am I having intrusive thoughts around OCD? Do I have PANDAS or PANS, which causes restrictive eating, normally related to some sort of intrusive thought? Those are my world type of issues. And they all go under the umbrella of ARFID. And so you get the extra help, the sensory help, the medical help, the anxiety or OCD help. And then we all together, all of us, who, no matter what bucket you're in, still have a picky eater that we need to work with. So whether you're working on the OCD or the anxiety or the PANDAS or the PANS or the sensory or the medical, now what do? We all have kids who equally all have a safe list of foods, and we don't know where to go. And I think that's where you come in, because that's where doesn't matter where you are on that plate, we're all there together. And then how do we approach that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's my passion. And that's the message I want to share with the world, is that there is something that can be done, but you do need to be getting help from somebody that understands that this isn't just an average picky eating situation, but it's something more. So I'd love to invite your audience to my free workshop series that's actually starting today. And in this workshop series, I'm going to teach my 2-step process of what it actually looks like to move your child from picky eater to really being a healthy child. And I wish I could put quotes around that word healthy, because I think our definition of healthy means a lot of different things. And I'll tell you, just to be really clear, what my definition of healthy is a child that is eating food, at least some foods from all of their food groups. So my food groups are having some proteins, having some carbs, and having some fruits and vegetables in their diet, so that they can come to the table and that it's not stressful, and that parents feel like they have enough foods that they're able to rotate through, and that their child is getting adequate nutrition and calories to grow. So this workshop series is brand new, and I've actually never taught all of this before. It's the heart of what I teach inside of my complete program, Mealtime Works. And it's really going to show parents that are in this picky eating, this extreme picky eating place, of what exactly those next steps are, so that you can begin to start getting real help. And we will not be talking anything about hiding vegetables in the macaroni and cheese.
And sign me up.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I have taken your program a long time ago, and it has been so long, and it was so helpful at the time. So I need to refresh my memory and definitely take your free workshop and check out your program, because I feel like whenever you talk about picky eating, I feel like you get it. And it's really rare for me to listen to someone talk about picky eating and not just slowly get irritated and annoyed by what they're saying. And so I think almost as a coping mechanism, I shut my ears off to anyone talking about picky eating, because it makes, and I'm sure a lot of people in my audience can relate to this, it makes me feel guilty. It's kind of like, parentally, there's so much guilt around nutrition for your kids. I mean, even if you don't have a picky eater, there's the guilt of, am I being a good mom or a good dad by providing them nutrition? But then when you have an extreme picky eater, there's some burden and guilt that you feel like you are responsible for starving your child, or your child's ability to be well nourished. And you might even get some well-meaning relatives or pediatricians making comments that will kind of reconfirm that. And so you never make me feel that way. Whenever I hear you talking about it, I always feel like she gets it. She's hearing, and she understands that this struggle is an acute situation, and it's not a parental issue. We just, as parents, need to know what to do and what not to do to improve the situation, and not, inadvertently make it worse.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I couldn't agree with you more. I had an extreme picky eater myself, but had already been treating picky eating for many years by the time I was given the gift of experiencing it myself as a parent and really having that perspective. But it's incredibly difficult for me to even hear other people's comments, casual comments in grocery store lines or birthday parties. And it's so important for me to educate, and anybody that knows me knows it is my soapbox. And if you bring it up around me, you're going to hear that there's really so much more to it. And it's not just as simple as feed your kid and they'll eventually get hungry. There's so much more to it. So I'm so glad that is the message that you're getting from me, because it's definitely how I feel.
Yeah, and I think it's good for everyone to get that, because I am messaged all the time by parents who don't know where to start, and they can't find local help on how to help their extreme picky eater. They can't find therapists that understand it. They get bad advice. And so the beauty of the online world is there's access to help in a virtual sort of way, and you can tap into experts like you without having to be finding someone locally. So I think that's awesome too. So how can people find your workshop and find your work in general?
Well, you can find me at yourkidstable.com. I blog there every week, and there is tons. I think I'm over 100 picky eating blog posts.
Wow.
So I might even be, I don't know, it could even be double that by now. I'm not even sure. But so there is tons of information on picky eating, tons of information on sensory processing. And I can give you a link, Natasha, to have them sign up for the workshop in your show notes.
Yes, I will always include that. So that'll be in the show notes. It'll be in my YouTube notes if you're watching this on YouTube, and it'll be on my website. So I'll have a link for the workshop and a link to your site as well.
Awesome. That's so great.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
You are so welcome. Thank you so much for having me here. It was great to talk to you.